we will go forward with the next keynote entitled Future G, The Dawn of Pervasive Intelligence, will be delivered by Fuad Siddiqui, Global Partner, EY.
So I titled this Future G and the Dawn of Pervasive Intelligence. You can look it up. We just published a longer article about this. And why I call it Future G, because this particular sector or this industry is very generationally driven, from 1G to 4G to 5G, and of course we are now in the 5th generation, and we keep mutating into different generations, whether it's 5.5G, 5.75, and hopefully getting into 6G. But I think the real interesting takeaway or the understanding is how can we help galvanize these generational shifts to the larger industry at large so that the economy and society can benefit, and as a result, we can elevate this telecom sector to its truest potential. And that's really what I would like us to think about, going beyond our day-to-day operational thinking and then exposing the power of these networks to drive true collective intelligence across our industry and society. I'll start a little bit about talking about some of these macro imperatives and the big shifts, because while we talk, as I said, some of our current challenges, it's really important to think about some of the macro factors and how technology and some of the future generations that we are developing is going to really help alter or mitigate those things. IMF has been year over year revising its growth forecast globally, and it's been declining ever since. And it's kind of alarming because we have seen a stagnation of productivity growth in our key sectors, which are the backbone of our economy. So something has to be done about it. The sectors which are representing the large part of our economy, being manufacturing, energy, transportation, utilities, they haven't really done much in terms of the digitalization potential. Of course, COVID has accelerated that, and every industry has now put in place a digital transformation programs. But again, that marriage, as we spoke earlier this morning with Dr. Bilal, is how do you bring that sector digitalization strategy with the power of these future G networks is where that sweet spot is if we really have to turn our economies around from a growth perspective. The second thing is, I mentioned that EY does this survey every year. We spoke to 1,000 enterprises and their CEOs and in 51 countries in 13 sectors, and 53% of the companies said when it comes to supply chains, they have either reshored or moved them around in terms of the impact of supply chain. And it's a big shift, because we've talked a lot about deglobalization in effect, and this is a little bit of the proof point around how supply chains are shifting. So we have to think about what is the role of future G and the future networks in ensuring that the supply chain works in the most interesting way possible, because again, that's the backbone of the economy, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then finally, the workforce and the jobs of the future. Of course, COVID has shown that everybody wants to work remotely, but we took it a little bit further in the context of the promise of these future technologies. We call it remote everything, which means that you should be able to have the ability to work, diagnose, manipulate, assemble, create, contextualize, convene from anywhere in the world. And that's, again, a notion of how do you stitch this common digital connectivity fabric together with cloud environments to drive that innovation. So that's really important. So keep these big shifts in mind and then see how we can underpin and create and imagine a different type of a future, because we do think we have to find new ways to augment and assist our world. And I think that the room here sits on some really powerful assets. They are innovating in technology. We just need to democratize and extend those technology paradigms to help some of these macro factors, and thereby reversing the positioning of the telecom sector in the overall global value chains. So we are entering an era, what I call the human industrial augmentation, and that is where we have to harness the world's collective intelligence. So I talked about supply chains. Everybody may have heard about everybody is concerned about supply chain issues, shortage of equipment part, bringing supply chains closer together. And the holy grail of supply chain is visibility, end-to-end visibility, pervasive intelligence, pervasive visibility at every touch point of the supply chain. How do you make that work? And I think that's where the future networks and the future generations are going to be supremely critical, because you're going to bring together different forms of networks in a much more intelligent fashion. So imagine we have a port somewhere where if you go inside the port itself, there are multitudes of things happening. There are 125 cranes which has to be managed in an autonomous fashion, which is loading and unloading containers. There are 3,000 to 4,000 autonomous trucks, high-definition sensors, camera, people communication, and you multiplex all these requirements together, it creates a bit of a prohibitive impact around how networks are going to deal with this. So you need to make sure that you have to enable, through your private networks and cloud instances, the business cases within the local environment for the first step of the supply chain. So moving containers faster and more autonomously from ship to shore, and then loading it on to trucks, which have to move out of the shipping yard into the mainland. And then again, how do you make sure that you maintain the visibility? That's where private networks and public networks starts to work together in a much more harmonious fashion. And who plays that role? Telecom providers have been investing both in private networks as well as public networks. And the real interesting portion there is going to be the interworking of the two environments, so that you can maintain the visibility and sell that visibility as a service towards the supply chain operators. And then the trucks have now left. You're monitoring the fleet. If there are autonomous trucks, you're monitoring the platoons. And then you get into the warehouse environment. And within the warehouse environment, you have these autonomous robots who have, again, different considerations around variable latencies. Robots are loading and unloading the containers, stacking up into different shelves, moving boxes between shelves, which again has a variable latency requirement. So you need to stitch this together. And the picture illustratively is saying that you need to have a distributed intelligence, which then gets interworked together. And of course, behind that, you see the satellite, and we talked about the LEO non-terrestrial configuration this morning. This is what the future G looks like. The future of networks, which are what we call the networks of networks. So private networks, public networks, working in a hyper-local area, wide area, and the extra-wide area. And you bring that together in a much more orchestrated fashion. You can switch around the supply chain dynamics, change the operating profits of the companies that are running these siloed operation, and there's a big role for this industry to play in this. So with that said, if I hear Andrew talk about this morning about the data and how this procedure he talked about, how it enhanced the data. If you remember this picture that I showed you, just the last slide, if we're going to connect everything the way we're going to connect, it's going to completely alter the complexion of the data we're going to generate. Today, 70 to 80% of data is coming from enterprise and consumer side of the business. Once we do this, it will actually change the complexion of how the data is being now captured from machines. And as a result, we have to harness this data in a very different manner. And this will be having a multiplicative effect how we do that. But today, if I just take the data points of today, this is something that we have looked at. This is public. This is called a knowledge doubling curve. According to IBM, knowledge or data is doubling every 12 hours. In today's environment, forget about the networks of networks and this end-to-end automated supply chains that I talked about. If data is doubling every 12 hours, imagine the strain it puts on the network to ingress the traffic and for humans to interpret and make sense of the data. And I think Leslie talked about enhancing human senses to deal with this. This is going to come pretty handy, because if today data is doubling every 12 hours, imagine in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to have a multiplicative effect. And that's not the only point of alarm in terms of the multiplication of data. It's humans' ability to deal with data hasn't changed, because there was an interesting data point. We saw that if humans don't learn, relearn, or repeat a task, we forget 90% of that in 20 days. And if that's the case, that our human abilities haven't extended, we need assistance, we need augmentation to drive that. And that's the whole promise of 6G and the future Gs, to be able to bring together humans and industries in a fashion where we can augment and extend our potential. Now, with that said, I think we need to think about a few other paradigms if how we would build these future G networks. We talked about this end-to-end supply chain visibility from a terrestrial and non-terrestrial perspective. There are standards in development, but I think it's prudent for telecoms to start thinking about their partnership models, where they are playing. Clearly, most of the telcos have built wide area networks. They are now venturing into private networks. I think Du has recently talked about managed private networks and others as well. And then as the developments happening on the LEO and the HAPS and other spaces, it's really important to think about the role of telecoms as the master orchestrator of this. You don't have to know everything about this, but there are partners and ecosystems we talked about. How do you orchestrate that? And then you don't have to be an expert in every industry you serve. You should be looking at certain use cases which will be transversal and applicable across sectors, whether it's AR, VR as a service, surveillance as a service, digital twin as a service. All of these services can be rendered if you create the foundational platform, what we call 5G+, which is bringing connectivity, multi-access connectivity, and computing together, and then offering that as a service. If you do that foundational paradigm, then you have basically an opportunity to multiply the value from the platform that you have built. And that's what EY has been trying to do, is to work with different sectors, manufacturing, logistics, mining, healthcare, and thinking about their use cases, trying to standardize a set of use cases, and then working with the telecoms and the technology providers to figure out how do we build that common stack from connectivity to compute and an application embedded AI and security fabric to drive that as a service. And this is an important consideration, because once you start to put that platform in place, you can alter the business model and sell and monetize this very differently. And that is going to be, again, a big shift for long-term value creation. Where is the money? We have looked at this from the spend pattern from the different sectors. $700 billion are expected to be spent by 2030 in what we call cloud-integrated networks, which is, again, integrated edge clouds coupled with enhanced connectivity fabric and the application suite. And the interesting data point that I'll give you, I've looked at some very large industrials, and they are spending a lot of money with digital transformation. I looked at their spend and the pattern of spend that they're having on multiple different technologies. And you can see they're spending on 24 technologies. And it doesn't make much sense, because they're all point investments. And so I say to my telecom friends, if you build a stack together, you can actually go to your enterprises and say, look, I can intercept this for you and do it 30% better for you. Because you don't have to invest in 24 technologies. We can build a stack for you, offer it to you as a service, and that will have the horizontal enabling capabilities to automate and digitize these use cases. And that is the marriage that Dr. Bilalbi talked about this morning as well. That is where the real promise is. And then I think from a key consideration perspective, as we help our telecom clients and the industry, we have been thinking about a few considerations which are, again, central to this. Ecosystem is growing in importance. We talked about it this morning as well. 73% of enterprises feel their biggest barrier to adoption is the fragmentation of the value chain. From devices to connectivity to platform to applications to systems integration, they have to deal with 24 vendors and 36 technology stack options, etc. And it's very difficult for enterprises. So again, the business model has to shift from telecoms to make it easier and consumable. And you have to figure out a way to partner with us or other professional services organization to figure out how do you go to market with them in a way that you could be the master orchestrator and bring this ecosystem relationships with you to enable new value. Cybersecurity and regulation, we talked quite a bit this morning as well. It's an extremely important consideration. Most of the CEOs believe that the new intelligent technologies and automation systems are not adequately addressing the data trust issues. And that is another hurdle that we have to overcome if we want to take telecoms into the enterprise segment. And finally, the human-centric approach. We did a study with the Oxford University recently, and we found out that most of the transformation programs fail because we haven't put the humans at the center. We haven't, at the very beginning, worked with them to understand and explain what a reimagined alternative future looks like and why would it benefit for them. Why should we come along this journey with us? So we talked about this in this morning panel as well, that putting people at the center of this transformation is going to go a long way. So taking this into consideration, I think, and thinking about the promise of this future G that we talked about, offers you a very interesting recipe to create further diversification and extending your telecom brands into sectors which have not fully recognized the power of the great work that you all do. And then finally, of course, because it's fashionable to talk about metaverse, not that I'm an expert in metaverse, but I think I would try to sum it up. This is my last slide, is I've seen everybody is now lumping everything into the context of metaverse, but I'll break it down for you. Where things are today in terms of value capture potential and the ecosystem complexity, we are doing a lot of augmented consumer experience. Leslie talked about it. We are moving into the consumer metaverse space. That's, of course, EY has done quite a bit in there. But my humble view is, again, there's a lot of potential in the industrial automation space. That's what's happening. Sectors are actually experimenting. They're investing with the Siemens, the Honeywells of the world, and all of these industrial operations technology providers. And again, as 5G matures, it creates that convergence between IT and OT, and that's a big opening for us in this industry to start to think about this. Once you get your foot in the door with the private networks industrial edge solution, you start to actually take into this industrial metaverse context. And that's where the real growth needs to happen. You need to claim and figure out where you want to play, what are the ecosystem partnerships, and that's the zone of advantage, what I call 5G+, bringing connectivity and computing together and offering it as a service. And then when you bring the human, extending the human senses and the industrial piece together, that's where 6G will start to come in, because we will build cyber-physical and cyber-life systems together and drive a different level of intelligence which will be pervasive in sense, and that's the 6G era. So in summary, what we are after is, we have a current state, a current trajectory of the industry when it comes to value creation. Maybe we are all doing what we can to experiment, reimagine different models. In order to create long-term sustainable value creation, we have to take enterprise and industrials very seriously and figure out how we would extend the promise of emerging technology to create a future state position. And that's where my focus is, my team's focus in, and EY is bringing our sector expertise, coupled with the emerging technology promise, and working with our telecom friends and the technology providers to build the right ecosystem that will position us for success. So with that, I'll stop, but I'll be around, and of course, we're happy to answer any questions and discuss further. Thank you so much.